At my granddaughter Chloe's wedding, my daughter-in-law Vanessa decided to make a joke that left me standing in front of 200 guests with the smell of spoiled wine soaking into my dress. And in that moment I realized that some people don't humiliate you because they hate you, but because they believe you have no power left to fight back. The ceremony was held at a country club just outside Portland, the kind of place with white columns, trimmed hedges, and staff who smiled even when they didn't know who you were. I had arrived early that morning, long before most of the guests, because I always believed that if something mattered to your family, you showed up before anyone else and stayed after everyone left. I wore a pale blue dress I had bought 2 weeks earlier, simple but elegant, the kind my late husband used to say made me look younger than I felt. The fabric was light, perfect for the warm afternoon, and I had chosen it carefully because Chloe had once told me blue was her favorite color. I remember standing near the reception hall windows, watching the staff finish setting the tables, thinking how proud my husband would have been to see our granddaughter getting married in a place like that. He worked 40 years to give this family stability, and moments like this were supposed to be proof that it had all meant something. Vanessa walked in about an hour later, wearing a perfectly tailored cream suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she inspected the room like she owned the building. She gave me that polite smile she always used in public, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Helen, you're early," she said, glancing at my dress before looking back at the seating chart in her hand. I told her I wanted to make sure everything was ready for Chloe, and she nodded without really listening, already turning to tell one of the staff members to move a centerpiece 2 inches to the left. That was Vanessa's way. Everything had to look perfect, even if the people around her didn't. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I'll give her that. The flowers were arranged in soft shades of white and pink, the chairs lined in perfect rows, the string quartet playing quietly as the guests took their seats. I sat in the second row on the bride's side, exactly where the card with my name had been placed, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel something close to peace. Chloe looked radiant walking down the aisle, and when she smiled at me as she passed, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just a little. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception hall, where the tables were covered in white linen and crystal glasses caught the afternoon light. I was standing near the head table, speaking with one of my husband's old friends about how quickly children grow up, when I heard Vanessa's voice behind me, loud enough that several people turned to look. "Helen, don't move," she said, laughing, holding a silver pitcher in her hand. I thought she was talking to someone else at first, but then I saw she was looking directly at me, her smile wide, her eyes bright in that way that always made me uneasy. "We need to fix something," she added, stepping closer, the smell reaching me before I even understood what she was doing. The liquid hit the front of my dress before my mind could catch up, cold and sour, running down the fabric in dark streaks that spread across the pale blue like ink on paper. A few people gasped. Someone dropped a fork. The smell was sharp, unmistakable, like wine that had been left too long in the sun. Vanessa laughed, covering her mouth as if she couldn't believe what she'd just done. "Oh my God, it's just a joke," she said quickly, looking around at the guests as if waiting for them to laugh with her. "Relax, Helen. It's only 2 liters. The dress will dry." For a second, nobody moved. The music stopped without anyone telling the musicians to stop. I could feel the liquid soaking into the fabric, clinging to my skin, the sour smell rising around me while 200 people watched to see what I would do. I reached down, smoothed the front of the dress with my hand, and then I looked up at Vanessa and smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to make her pause. "It's fine," I said quietly, my voice steady even though my heart felt like it was beating somewhere outside my chest. "Accidents happen." A few guests let out nervous laughs, the kind people make when they don't know which side they're supposed to be on. Vanessa blinked, clearly expecting something else, maybe tears, maybe anger, maybe the kind of scene she could later describe as me being dramatic. Instead, I picked up my purse from the chair beside me and walked toward the restroom as if nothing unusual had happened, the smell of spoiled wine following me across the polished floor while the room slowly filled with whispers. I closed the restroom door behind me, stood in front of the mirror, and looked at the woman staring back. The blue dress was stained, the fabric dark and heavy, but my face was calm, almost expressionless. For a long moment I said nothing. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded envelope I had been carrying all day, and set it carefully on the counter beside the sink, because the truth was, Vanessa thought she had embarrassed an old woman in front of her family. But what she didn't know was that the entire wedding, every flower, every chair, every glass on every table, still depended on a signature that only I could give. I stayed in the restroom longer than I needed to, not because I was trying to clean the dress, but because I wanted the room outside to settle without me in it. The sour smell of the wine was still there, clinging to the fabric no matter how many paper towels I pressed against it. And after a while I stopped trying to fix it. At my age, you learn the difference between something that can be repaired and something that needs to be remembered exactly as it happened. I folded the damp towels neatly and placed them on the counter, then picked up the envelope I had set beside the sink and held it in both hands for a moment before putting it back into my purse. When I walked out, the hallway outside the restroom was quiet, but I could hear the reception again, the music starting slowly as if the musicians were not sure whether they were supposed to continue. Conversations sounded softer now, lower, the way people talk when something uncomfortable has happened and nobody wants to be the first one to mention it. I stepped back into the reception hall and felt the change immediately. A few people looked at me and then quickly looked away. Others watched longer, their expressions caught somewhere between sympathy and curiosity. My seat at the table was still there, the place card with my name written in careful black ink exactly where it had been before, as if nothing had happened at all. I walked over, pulled the chair out, and sat down slowly, smoothing the front of the dress again even though the stain was impossible to ignore. Across the room, Vanessa was speaking to the wedding planner, her hands moving quickly as she talked, her smile tight now, not as relaxed as it had been earlier. She glanced in my direction once, just for a second, and then looked away as if she had already decided the moment was over. Daniel was standing near the bar with two of his friends, holding a glass he was not drinking from. When he saw me sitting down, he hesitated, like he was about to come over, but then one of the men said something to him, and he stayed where he was. That was how it had been for the last few years. Small hesitations, small silences, little moments where he chose the easier side of the room. The waiter came by and asked softly if I needed anything, his voice careful, almost apologetic, and I thanked him and asked for a glass of water. My hands were steady when I picked it up, which surprised me more than anything else. I was not angry, not the way people expect. I was thinking. I looked around the room slowly, taking in every detail the way my husband used to do when he walked through a job site, noticing things other people never paid attention to. The flowers on the head table were the same ones I had approved 3 weeks earlier. The band playing near the dance floor was the same group I had spoken to on the phone to confirm the schedule. Even the silverware on the tables had been chosen from the catalog the country club manager showed me in his office. The afternoon I signed the final agreement, so Chloe would not have to worry about any of it. Vanessa had planned the colors and the decorations, yes, but the foundation of the entire day had been built long before she ever decided what shade of napkin she wanted. I took another sip of water and let the glass rest in my hand while I watched the guests begin to relax again, the laughter slowly returning as people convinced themselves the scene they had witnessed was not important enough to ruin a wedding. That was the thing about public embarrassment. Most people did not remember the details. They only remembered who stayed calm. A few minutes later, the master of ceremonies walked to the microphone and tapped it lightly, asking everyone to take their seats because the speeches would begin soon. I saw Vanessa straighten her shoulders at the head table, adjusting her bracelet as if she was preparing for a performance. She leaned toward Robert and said something that made him nod, though his expression looked uncertain. I reached into my purse again, feeling the edge of the envelope with my fingers without taking it out this time, just making sure it was still there. The paper inside was thicker than ordinary paper, the kind lawyers used for documents that were meant to last longer than the people who signed them. I rested my hand on my lap and waited while the first speech began, listening to the polite applause, the soft laughter, the careful words about family and new beginnings. Vanessa did not look at me again, not once, and that told me more than anything she could have said out loud, because people who believe they have already won never think to check who is still sitting quietly at the table. I listened to the speeches the way you listen to a story you already know the ending to, calm on the outside, careful on the inside, letting every word pass without showing what it really meant. The bride's father spoke first, thanking everyone for coming. talking about how proud he was of Chloe, how families come together on days like this, how love makes everything stronger. People nodded, some of them wiping their eyes, and for a moment the room looked exactly the way it was supposed to look, like nothing uncomfortable had ever happened there. I kept my hands folded on the table, the damp fabric of my dress cool against my skin, and I watched Vanessa while everyone else watched the microphone. She laughed at the right moments, leaned closer to the guests beside her when the jokes were told, touched Robert's arm when she wanted him to smile. Anyone who did not know her well would have thought she was the one holding the whole evening together. That was one of the things she was always good at. She knew how to look like the center of a celebration, even when someone else had built it. The second speech was shorter, one of Chloe's friends talking about college memories, and during the applause that followed, I felt someone step up beside my chair. I looked up and saw Mr. Harris standing there, holding his program in both hands the way he always did when he did not want to draw attention to himself. He had been our family attorney for more than 20 years, long enough to know when to speak and when to wait. "Helen," he said quietly, leaning just close enough so nobody else could hear. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." I told him I was fine, and he looked at the front of my dress for a second before nodding slowly, as if he understood more than I had said. "If you need anything," he added, his voice low, "you know the agreement is still exactly the way you signed it." I met his eyes for a moment, and that was enough. We did not need to say the rest out loud. He gave a small, polite smile, then moved on toward the back of the room like he had only stopped to greet an old friend. I watched him go, then picked up my glass again, letting the cold water sit in my mouth for a second before swallowing. Across the table, one of the guests leaned toward me and said she loved my dress, her voice overly cheerful, the way people talk when they are trying to pretend they did not notice something earlier. I thanked her, and she kept talking about the flowers, the music, the weather, anything that sounded safe. I nodded at the right places, but my attention kept drifting back to the head table. Vanessa was checking her phone now, just for a second, then slipping it back into her purse when she realized someone was looking. Robert leaned closer to her and whispered something, and she shook her head slightly, her smile still in place even though her eyes had tightened. I had seen that look before, years ago, when she first started coming to family dinners and realized she was not the one making the decisions yet. Back then she had been patient. She learned where the power was, learned who signed the checks, learned who everyone called when something needed to be fixed. After my husband passed, those calls slowly stopped coming to me and started going to her. And I let that happen because I thought keeping the peace mattered more than being right. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the family would stay whole. The master of ceremonies announced that the next speaker would be the grandmother of the bride, and I heard a few people clap before they even realized who that meant. Vanessa's head turned so quickly that the movement almost broke her smile. Robert looked at me, then at her, clearly unsure whether this had been planned. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up, smoothing the front of the dress again, even though the stain had already dried into the fabric. The room felt warmer as I walked toward the microphone, the sound of my shoes on the floor louder than the music had been. When I reached the front, I placed one hand on the podium and looked out at the tables, at the flowers, at the faces that had been laughing only a few minutes earlier. For a second, nobody spoke. Then I smiled, the same small smile I had given in the restroom mirror, and I began exactly the way I had planned to, calm, steady, and polite. Because people like Vanessa always think the danger has passed the moment the old woman stops raising her voice. And that is usually the moment they forget whose name is written on the paper that made the whole day possible. I adjusted the microphone slightly, not because it needed to be moved, but because it gave me a moment to let the room settle. When you reach my age, you learn that silence can make people listen more carefully than any loud voice ever could. I looked at Chloe first, because this was her day, and none of what had happened earlier was her fault. She smiled at me, a little uncertain, the way she used to look when she was a little girl waiting to see if she had done something right. That was when I began to speak, keeping my voice calm and even, the same tone I had used for years when I read bedtime stories or gave holiday toasts at the end of long dinners. I said that I had watched Chloe grow from a child who used to sit on my kitchen counter eating cookies before dinner into a young woman who could plan a life of her own, and that nothing made a grandmother prouder than seeing her family continue forward. People relaxed when they heard that. I could see shoulders drop, hear a few soft laughs. the room slowly deciding that whatever tension had been there before was over. That was exactly what I wanted. I thanked the guests for coming, thanked the staff for their work, and even thanked Vanessa for organizing such a beautiful reception, which made a few heads turn in surprise. Vanessa smiled back at me, the polite smile again, but this time I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. She did not like not knowing where a conversation was going. I went on, talking about my husband, about how he used to say that family celebrations were not really about the flowers or the music, but about the promises people made to each other in front of everyone who mattered. I said he believed that when you signed your name to something, whether it was a marriage license, a contract, or even a simple receipt, that signature meant responsibility. The word responsibility seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, and a few people shifted in their seats without knowing why. I rested my hand on the side of the podium, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers, and for a second I remembered the afternoon I sat in Mr. Harris's office 6 months earlier, the two of us going over page after page of paperwork while the air conditioner hummed in the window. Chloe had wanted a wedding she would never forget, and I had told her she deserved one, even if it meant signing more forms than I cared to count. I told the room that planning a wedding was never as simple as people thought, that behind every perfect evening there were agreements, deposits, and signatures that made everything possible long before the first guest arrived. A few people nodded at that, the older ones mostly, the ones who knew how much work it took to make a celebration look effortless. I glanced toward Mr. Harris, who was standing near the back with his hands folded in front of him, and he gave the smallest nod, the kind only someone looking directly at him would notice. Then I looked back at the tables and let my gaze move slowly across the guests until it stopped at Vanessa. She was still smiling, but now the smile looked fixed in place, like she was holding it there on purpose. I thanked everyone again for being part of the day, and I said that nothing made me happier than knowing the family could come together for something so important, even after all the changes we had been through in the last few years. I said that after my husband passed, I promised myself I would do whatever I could to keep our family strong, even if that meant stepping back sometimes and letting others take the lead. That line got a few murmurs of agreement, the kind people make when they think they understand what you mean. Then I paused, just long enough for the room to become completely quiet again. I said that the only thing I had asked in return for stepping back was that the things I signed my name to would be treated with the same respect I gave when I agreed to them. This time nobody laughed, nobody moved, and I could feel the attention in the room shift in a way that had nothing to do with the microphone or the speech anymore. I picked up the glass of water someone had placed on the podium and took a small sip, not because I needed it, but because it gave everyone one more second to wonder what I was about to say next. And when I set the glass down again, I spoke just a little more slowly, telling them that before the night went any further, there was one small detail about this reception that I needed to make perfectly clear, because sometimes the person who looks like a guest at the table is still the one whose name is written on the agreement that allows the celebration to continue. For a moment after I said those words, the room stayed completely still, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any noise. I could see people looking at each other, trying to understand whether what I had just said was part of the speech or something else entirely. I kept my hand resting on the side of the podium, steady, relaxed, as if I had all the time in the world. When you do not rush, people assume you are in control, and that assumption alone can change the entire direction of a room. I said that when Chloe first told me she wanted her wedding to be held at this country club, she had been worried it would cost more than she and Robert could manage, and that she almost chose a smaller place just to avoid putting pressure on anyone. I told them I remembered that conversation very clearly, because it reminded me of the way my husband used to worry about every dollar when our son was young, wanting to give him the best life he could without ever letting him feel the weight of it. A few people smiled at that, the older guests especially, the ones who understood how often parents carry things their children never see. I said that 6 months ago, when the reservations had to be finalized, the manager of the club had explained that the contract required one name, one signature, one person responsible for everything that happened in this room from the first chair that was set up to the last glass that would be cleared away tonight. I paused there, letting the words settle, because I knew some of them were starting to remember how those agreements usually worked. I told them that at the time, Robert had been busy, Vanessa had been handling the decorations, and Chloe had been overwhelmed with work, So I offered to take care of the paperwork myself, just to make sure the day she dreamed about would not be lost over something as simple as a signature. Someone near the back nodded slowly, and I saw Mr. Harris shift his weight slightly, still watching without saying a word. I went on, explaining that when you sign a contract like that, you do not just promise to pay for the flowers or the food. You promise that the entire event will follow the terms written on the page, and that the club will only continue the reception as long as the person whose name is on the agreement allows it. This time the silence felt different, tighter, like the air itself had stopped moving. Vanessa was not smiling anymore. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, but the fingers were pressed together so hard that the knuckles looked pale even from where I was standing. Robert leaned toward her, whispering something I could not hear, and she shook her head once without looking at him. I picked up the envelope from the podium where I had placed it a moment earlier and held it lightly between my fingers, not waving it, not raising my voice, just letting everyone see that it existed. I said that I did not mention any of this earlier because tonight was supposed to be about Chloe, not about paperwork or responsibilities, and I had every intention of sitting quietly at my table and enjoying the evening like any other guest. A few people shifted in their chairs, remembering what had happened before the speeches started, and I could feel the attention turn toward the head table again, without anyone needing to say a word. I said that sometimes, though, a person is reminded in a very public way that they are only welcome as long as others believe they have no real say in what is happening. And when that reminder comes, it is only fair to make sure everyone understands exactly who agreed to what in the first place. I opened the envelope slowly, the sound of the paper louder than it should have been in such a large room, and I took out the first page, holding it so the light from the chandeliers caught the signature at the bottom. I did not read the whole document. There was no need. I only read the line that mattered, the one that stated the reception would continue under the authorization of the person whose name appeared below. Then I looked up, meeting Vanessa's eyes for the first time since I stepped to the microphone, and I spoke in the same calm voice I had used from the beginning, telling the room that my name was the one on that line, and that I had no intention of ruining Chloe's wedding. But respect, like any agreement, only works when both sides remember who made it possible. For the celebration to begin, I let the paper rest on the podium for a moment after I finished speaking, not because I needed to read anything else, but because I wanted everyone to understand that the decision about what happened next did not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the person who had signed the agreement long before anyone started choosing flowers or tasting cakes. The silence that followed felt different from the ones earlier in the evening. Before, people had been unsure. Now they were waiting. I looked toward Chloe first, because she was the only one who truly mattered in that moment, and I could see the confusion on her face, the way she was trying to understand why her wedding suddenly felt like something fragile instead of something certain. I gave her a small smile, the same one I used when she was little and fell off her bicycle, the kind that said everything was still going to be all right even if it did not feel that way yet. Then I turned my eyes toward the head table. Vanessa had not moved. She was sitting perfectly straight, her hands still folded, but the color in her face had changed, and the smile she had been holding all evening was gone completely now. Robert looked from her to me and back again, like he was trying to decide which one of us he should be worried about. I spoke again, calmly, telling everyone that there was no reason for the night to end badly, and that I had no interest in embarrassing anyone the way I had been embarrassed earlier, because a celebration should never turn into a competition over who can hurt the other more. A few people let out quiet breaths at that, the tension easing just enough for them to believe the worst had passed. I said that all I wanted was the same thing I had wanted from the beginning, for Chloe to have the wedding she deserved, in the place she loved, with her family sitting together instead of pulling apart over something that should never have happened. I folded the paper once, slowly, and slid it back into the envelope, making sure everyone could see that I was not tearing it, not throwing it away, only putting it back where it belonged. That small movement seemed to change the room more than anything I had said. Conversation started again in low voices. Chairs shifted. Someone near the back laughed too loudly at something that was not very funny, the way people do when they are relieved but not ready to admit it. I stepped away from the podium, but I did not return to my seat right away. Instead, I walked past the head table, close enough that Vanessa had to look up at me whether she wanted to or not. For a second, neither of us spoke. Up close, I could see the tightness in her jaw, the way she was trying to hold on to the same confidence she had earlier, even though the room no longer felt like it belonged to her. I leaned slightly toward her, not enough for anyone else to hear what I was about to say, and I kept my voice quiet, almost gentle, the way you speak to someone when you are giving them a choice they did not expect to have. I told her that a wedding lasts one day, but the way people treat each other during it can stay in a family for the rest of their lives. I said that I had spent most of my life building things that were meant to last longer than one afternoon, and I had no intention of letting pride destroy something my husband worked 40 years to hold together. She did not answer right away. Her eyes moved past me toward the podium, then toward Mr. Harris standing near the wall, and then back to my face again. I straightened, gave her the same polite nod I would give any guest at the table, and walked back to my chair. When I sat down, the waiter appeared almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for the signal that the evening could continue, and he asked if he could bring me another glass of water. I thanked him and said yes, my voice steady, my hands resting calmly on the table as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Across the room, the band started playing again, softly at first, then louder, the sound filling the space where the tension had been only a few minutes before. People began talking, laughing, standing up to greet each other, the reception slowly finding its rhythm again. But every so often, someone would glance toward me, then toward the head table, and then back again, because even though the music had returned and the lights still shone the same way, everyone in that room now knew something they had not known before, that the person who had been treated like she did not belong was still the one who had the power to decide whether the celebration would end with applause or with silence. The music grew louder as the band moved into a slower song, the kind people use as an excuse to stand up and walk around, to shake hands, to pretend the last few minutes had only been a small misunderstanding instead of something everyone would remember long after the night was over. I sat at the table with my glass of water in front of me, watching the room settle into a new kind of order, not the same one as before, but not broken either. That was the thing about families. They could bend farther than anyone expected, as long as someone knew exactly how far to push and when to stop. Chloe came to my table first. She lifted the front of her dress slightly, so she would not step on it, her expression still uncertain but softer than it had been when I was standing at the microphone. She put her hand on my shoulder the way she used to when she wanted to ask something without saying it out loud. I looked up at her and smiled, the same calm smile I had kept all evening, and told her she looked beautiful. She asked quietly if everything was all right, and I told her the truth, that everything was exactly the way it needed to be, and that tonight belonged to her, not to any argument, not to any mistake, not to any moment that should never have happened. She studied my face for a second longer, as if she was trying to decide whether to believe me. Then she nodded and hugged me carefully so she would not wrinkle her dress. When she walked away, I saw Vanessa watching from the head table, her eyes following every step, her posture stiff in a way she could not hide anymore. Robert came over next, slower, his hands in his pockets like he had forgotten what to do with them. He stood beside the chair instead of sitting down, looking at the stain on my dress before he looked at my face. He started to say something, stopped, then tried again, his voice low enough that the people at the next table could not hear. He said he did not know what Vanessa had been thinking earlier, that it was supposed to be a joke, that things had gotten out of hand. I let him finish without interrupting, because sometimes people need to hear their own words before they understand how empty they sound. When he was done, I told him that a joke only works when everyone is laughing, and that respect only works when everyone remembers who deserves it. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the table, and for a moment, he looked like the same boy who used to stand in the kitchen waiting for his father to tell him whether he had done something right or wrong. I told him to go back to his table, that Chloe needed her father smiling tonight, not standing in the corner worrying about something that could not be changed. He hesitated, then put his hand on my shoulder once, quick and awkward, before walking away. Vanessa did not come over. She stayed where she was, speaking to the guests beside her, laughing when they laughed, lifting her glass when they lifted theirs, but every few seconds her eyes moved across the room toward my table, as if she could not stop checking whether I was still there. I took a slow sip of water and set the glass down carefully, feeling the cool surface of the table under my fingertips, steady, solid, exactly where it had been all evening. The waiter brought out the next course, plates moving from table to table, the normal rhythm of a reception filling the space again. People started talking about the food, the music, the weather, anything that sounded safe, anything that did not require them to mention the moment when the entire evening had nearly come apart. Mr. Harris walked past my table on his way toward the exit and paused just long enough to give me a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had given me in his office months earlier when the last page of the contract was signed. I nodded back, nothing more, because everything that needed to be said had already been said without words. Across the room, the band changed to a faster song, and a few of the younger guests began to dance, their laughter louder now, the tension fading into something that looked almost like celebration again. I watched them for a moment, then leaned back in my chair, letting my hands rest in my lap, the envelope still inside my purse where I had placed it after the speech. I had not used it to end the night, and I had not needed to. Sometimes the strongest reminder is not the one you shout across a room, but the one you let everyone see and then choose not to use, because after that, nobody forgets who could have. By the time the second round of dancing started, the reception finally looked the way it was supposed to look from the beginning. Full tables, music echoing off the walls, people talking loudly enough that the earlier silence felt like something that had happened days ago instead of less than an hour before. I stayed in my chair for a while, watching the guests move across the floor, the younger ones laughing too hard, the older ones clapping along with the music, everyone slowly choosing to remember the evening as a celebration instead of a confrontation. That is what most people do when they are given the chance. They choose the version of the story that lets them sleep at night. I was reaching for my glass when I saw Vanessa stand up from the head table. She did not look at me right away. She said something to the woman beside her, then adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, then picked up her purse as if she needed something from it. Only after all of that did she start walking toward my table. The closer she came, the quieter the conversation around me became, not completely silent, but softer, like people could feel something important was about to happen and did not want to miss it. She stopped beside my chair, standing straight, her shoulders back, her expression carefully controlled the way it always was when she needed to fix a situation without admitting it had gone wrong. For a second, she did not speak. Then she said my name, not loudly, not softly, just enough for me to hear it clearly over the music. I looked up at her and waited. She said she wanted to talk for a moment, and I nodded toward the empty chair across from me. She did not sit down. She stayed standing, her fingers resting on the back of the chair like she was not sure how long she planned to stay. She said that earlier had been a misunderstanding, that the joke with the wine had been meant to lighten the mood, that everything had been stressful and she had not realized how it would look. I listened without interrupting, the same way I had listened to Robert, letting her finish every sentence even when the words began to repeat themselves. When she was done, she looked at me like she was waiting for me to say something that would make the moment disappear. I folded my hands on the table and told her that weddings are stressful, that families say things they should not say, that people make mistakes, and that none of that surprised me anymore. She nodded quickly at that, relief starting to show in her face, but I had not finished speaking. I told her that what surprised me was not the mistake itself, but how easily some people forget who was standing beside them when everything was still uncertain, when the plans were not finished, when the bills had not been paid yet. Her expression changed again, not anger, not exactly fear, but the look people get when they realize the conversation is not going the way they expected. I reached for my purse, opened it slowly, and took out the envelope, placing it on the table between us without pushing it toward her, without opening it, just letting it sit there where she could see it. I told her that I had not used this tonight because Chloe deserved to remember her wedding for the music and the laughter, not for an argument over a piece of paper, but that the paper still meant exactly what it had meant when I signed it. And it would continue to mean that tomorrow, and the day after that, and every time this family forgot how we got here. She looked down at the envelope, then back at me, her lips pressed together like she was trying to decide whether to say something else or to let the moment end. For the first time all evening, she pulled the chair out and sat down across from me, her voice lower now, almost careful. She said she did not know the contract was in my name, that Robert had handled most of the details, that she thought everything had already been taken care of. I told her it had been taken care of. That was exactly the point. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Around us the music kept playing, Glasses clinked. Someone laughed loudly near the dance floor. The reception continuing as if nothing at all was happening at our table. Finally, she nodded once, a small movement, but real, and she said that she was sorry. Not dramatic, not loud, just the word itself, spoken like she understood it mattered more than anything else she could say. I looked at her for a moment longer. Then I slid the envelope back into my purse and closed it, the sound of the clasp clicking shut louder to me than the music in the room. Because sometimes the moment you put something away is the moment everyone understands it could have been used, and that understanding is enough to make sure it never needs to be used again. The rest of the evening moved forward the way most long family celebrations do, slowly at first, then all at once, until it almost felt as if the tension from earlier had been nothing more than a moment everyone agreed not to mention again. Vanessa stayed at my table for a few seconds after she said she was sorry, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the chair, as if she wanted to be sure I had heard her clearly. I nodded once, not smiling, not frowning, just acknowledging the word for what it was. An apology does not erase anything, but it changes what comes next, and sometimes that is enough. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back toward the head table with the same careful posture she had used all evening. But this time, there was something different in the way she moved. Not weaker, not defeated, just aware in a way she had not been before. Robert watched her return, then glanced toward me, and when our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he realizes something important has happened, and he is not going to argue about it. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, the first one I had not been holding since the moment the wine hit my dress. The band was playing a lively song now, and a group of guests had gathered near the dance floor, clapping in rhythm while Chloe and her husband laughed in the center of the circle. I watched her spin once, the white fabric of her dress catching the light, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to feel what I had wanted to feel from the beginning, that this was a good day, not a perfect one, but a good one, and that was enough. The waiter came by again and asked if I would like coffee, and I said yes, because coffee at the end of a long evening always reminds me of the way my husband used to sit at the kitchen table after everyone else went to bed, saying the day was not finished until the coffee was poured. When the cup was placed in front of me, I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, steady and familiar. Mr. Harris passed by my table on his way toward the exit once more, his coat over his arm this time, and he paused just long enough to say that everything had worked out exactly the way it should. I told him that sometimes the best outcome is the one where nothing has to be forced, and he smiled like a man who understood contracts better than conversations. As the night went on, guests began to leave one by one, stopping at my table to say goodnight, some of them mentioning the speech, some of them saying nothing about it at all, but all of them looking at me with the same expression people use when they realize someone they thought was quiet has been paying attention the whole time. Vanessa came over again just before the cake was served, this time with Robert beside her. She did not sit down. She simply said she hoped I would stay until the end, that Chloe wanted a picture with everyone together before the night was over. I told her I would stay, because family pictures matter, even when the people in them do not always agree. She nodded, and this time the smile she gave me looked real, smaller than the ones she used in front of guests, but real enough that I could accept it without wondering what it meant. When the photographer called us all to the front of the room, I stood beside Chloe, Robert on one side, Vanessa on the other, the four of us close enough that our shoulders touched. The camera flash went off once, then again, capturing the kind of moment that looks simple when you see it later, for people standing together at a wedding, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just a family. After the pictures were done, I picked up my purse and slipped the envelope deeper inside, making sure the clasp closed completely before I stood up. I knew I would probably never need to show that paper again, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Power is not in the moment you use it. Power is in the moment everyone understands that you could have, and chose not to. I walked toward the exit slowly, stopping once to look back at the room, the lights, the music, the laughter, all of it still going on without me, exactly the way it should. Outside, the night air felt cool against my face, carrying away the last trace of the sour smell from my dress. And as I stepped down the front stairs of the country club, I realized something my husband used to say was true after all, that respect in a family is not given by the loudest voice at the table, but by the person who knows when to stay silent, when to speak, and when to walk away, knowing the whole room finally understands who kept the celebration from falling apart.